Well, a warm welcome to everybody to this first plenary debate at the Belgrade Security Forum. It's a key session on the big picture, reflecting on the big changes to our world since the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, and considering the challenges that lie ahead now. Now, you'll immediately notice that Deputy Prime Minister Vučić is not here. And at the very last minute, he has sent his profound apologies. He has been told he has to go for health checks for his blood pressure. So that's what's happening to him now. So we wish him well, but he does send the most profound apologies. But we do have a fantastic panel of experts here. My name is Richard Thompson. I'm the former head of news coverage for the BBC World Service and BBC World Television. I was the BBC Television foreign editor when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, when Israel invaded Lebanon, when Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, and when the American president and the Pope were both shot within 6 weeks of each other. Yes, I'm that old. Well, the world has changed dramatically since those days. It has certainly changed since the 1977 Security Conference at the Sava Center here in Belgrade, which did so much to establish the OSCE. And the OSCE is going to be a focus of this debate today. In that year, the world's first personal computer, the Commodore PET, was demonstrated in Chicago. And now computers absolutely dominate our lives. So in this session, we'll be looking ahead to Helsinki plus 40. That means 2 years from now, 2015, 40 years after the Helsinki agreements, with a focus on the OSCE, which is involved in a major reassessment of its role and priorities. And we're fortunate to have a fantastic panel of top experts in security issues and international affairs. So let me introduce them to you. On my right, from Bern, Ambassador Heidi Grau is head of Switzerland's OSCE Chairmanship Task Force, preparing for Switzerland to take over the OSCE chair next year. And Serbia will have the chairmanship in the year after that, in 2015, the 40th anniversary year. And in an innovative move, the two countries have agreed to work very closely together in a 2-year chairmanship package for continuity. From the OSCE headquarters in Vienna, on my left is Ambassador Adam Kobieracki. He's director of the OSCE Conflict Prevention Center there, which plays a pivotal role in promoting peace and stability through mediation and dialogue between states. He's hugely experienced in this field with the Foreign Ministry in his native Poland, with NATO in Brussels, and as head of the Polish delegation to the OSCE, where he's led countless negotiations on arms reduction and conflict prevention measures. And from Washington, D.C., we've got Andrew Michaels. He's the Senior Policy Advisor for USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. He's worked for the US government all over the world. He also teaches graduate courses in security and rule of law at George Washington University and the Center for Global Affairs at New York University. So please will you give a warm welcome to our panel. If you can make sure your mobile phones are switched off, we'd appreciate that. You'll be glad to know there are going to be no formal speeches, no presentations. This is going to be a discussion, and there will be plenty of opportunity for you to take part. So I hope that you will do that. There is a huge amount of expertise in international security issues in this room, so don't be afraid to make your points when that time comes. I thought we'd start by asking each of the three guests what has really changed since 1975. The world is obviously developing all the time, but in security terms, I'm wondering what are the main challenges now? Especially as the OSCE is thinking of what its priorities should be. So let's start with Ambassador Grau. What do you think we are facing now and in the near future?
Thank you very much, and warm welcome to everyone also from my side. I'm really pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to speak about OSCE and our chairmanship, or the tandem rather chairmanship of Switzerland and Serbia. So Richard mentioned the changes since '75. I mean, the most obvious one is the end of the Cold War, the end of the two blocs, the end of one of the defense or military alliances, and a profound transformation that happened in Europe, profound changes also of the European map. Some states disappeared, others arrived. What we see is a growing complexity also of issues, of interests. What we see is more connectivity, globalization. I think that is probably the key change since '75 if you look back, and globalization has its advantages and of course its disadvantages. The EU kept growing. We have now a situation where the OSCE that consists of 57 participating states. At the same time, there is half of the membership are EU members, so we have 28 out of 57 that are OSCE members, and at the same time they are in the EU. What we also saw since '75 is a growing body of norms, commitments, principles. It started with the Helsinki Final Act, but since then this body of commitments has evolved. And interestingly enough, last time in Astana, the OSCE members again committed themselves to the whole body of norms and principles. I think that's quite important, and maybe we can talk about this later on.
But,
so
in terms of the globalized world and changing map, is it a dangerous world now as well, or is it a more stable world?
Difficult to say. I mean, what is obvious and almost a cliche is, as I mentioned, is the connectivity. So in a world that is so connected as the world today, I think a security community becomes even more important, because the security of one state affects, or the insecurity of one state affects the security of all the states around it. And I think that is the key notion of a security community, that we have to make sure that we can ensure security by cooperation. And that's also very much what you see already in the title of the organization. It's Organization for Security and Cooperation. And I would even like to call it the Organization for Security through Cooperation. So connectivity of risks needs a connectivity also of answers, a collective endeavor, and that's very much still where the OSCE comes in and has something to offer to
yes,
the
let me come back to you on that in a minute. Ambassador Kobiratsky, you've been involved in what you might call the traditional activities of the OSCE, arms reduction. Are there new threats now that you require some kind of change of approach? Is there something that is now 21st century issues that the international community has got to switch its priorities, and what do you see as the main threats?
First of all, you said at the beginning that there's huge expertise in this room. I'm sure there is. The problem is I can't see this room. And I almost feel tempted to plead guilty and to leave the stage, given the light.
The lights are very strong.
Now, of course, there are new threats. I mean, I mean, everybody would say that 21st century we're dealing with new security environment, new threats and challenges, transnational threats, cyber, whatever. We tried to respond to those inside the Secretariat. More than a year ago, we established a special department, Transnational Affairs Department, exactly to deal with those issues. However, if you're looking at differences between 40 years ago and today, or between, say, what OSCE was and what it was doing something like 20 years ago and what it is doing now, the main problem for us is the changed position of participating states on the principle of non-interference in internal affairs. The biggest achievement of the Helsinki Final Act and then the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe was that despite the Cold War towards its end, the participating states accepted that OSCE could interfere into their internal affairs. What we're seeing now is that most of participating states are actually coming back to what I would call absolutization of this principle. That's why we're having more problems, not just because there are different threats to security. That's also true. But the attitude of participating states towards the role of the OSCE established 20 years ago is today different.
Let me just get this clear. You're saying that some states are more inclined to intervene internally or less inclined to intervene?
They are less inclined to accept OSCE interventions in their internal affairs, less than it was the case 20 years ago, when we established all kinds of OSCE mechanisms, Berlin, Moscow, Copenhagen, whatever, mechanism. The idea behind those mechanisms was to give the instrument to the OSCE, collectively to all participating states, to intervene into internal affairs, say the way in which human dimensions commitment are being met in some participating states. That was acceptable 20 years ago, doesn't seem to be acceptable or is less acceptable today.
So are we talking about Moscow here, that it's been got on the record that they don't like these international NGOs sticking their nose into their affairs? Is that what you're saying?
No, it's not what I'm saying. Of course we're talking about Moscow, but we're not talking only about Moscow. I mean, I'm complaining about all OSCE participating states, including Poland. Yeah. And I'm a Polish diplomat.
Yeah. Well, that's extremely interesting. Yeah. In your conflict prevention center in Vienna, you have a 24/7 situation room monitoring areas of tension. I mean, is it all quiet there at the moment, or are there issues that are of particular concern to you?
Yes, we have this service, and actually it's an excellent service. Basically, it's gathering information, of course, from open sources, and part of the focus is on those parts of the OSCE area where we have our field presences, our missions, but I stress it's a part of the focus. Otherwise, it looks at information coming from the entire OSCE area. But my problem with that, as the director of the CPC, is that I'm getting on my computer, on my desk, all kinds of analysis, reports, including early warning signals, which I can hardly share with all OSCE participating states. Because participating states are not ready to accept that there might be a warning signal or early warning signal coming from a secretariat concerning this given participating state. They are ready to accept it as a principle as long as it applies to others.
Okay, well, that's extremely interesting, so it's a challenge for the OSCE. We'll pursue that in a minute. Andrew Michaels, I mean, from the perspective of the United States, is it all about terrorism now? You know, the 21st century was ushered in by a great act of terrorism in the United States, and that's, you know, led us to Afghanistan and so on. You've worked in Afghanistan and Pakistan, so you know this issue. Is that what has changed, terrorism?
Thank you for that challenging question, Richard. First, at the outset, let me say that I'm speaking now on my own behalf and not on behalf of my government. I think there are all sorts of phenomena which challenge the state. The very title of this conference suggests that the state is, in some senses, under threat from various parties and various principles. parties, organized violence, extremist violence in various forms, and also, in principle, by legal norms, such as the responsibility to protect. So the state faces a number of challenges to its very existence and tries to craft responses. In some cases, I think the seductive response was the application of tremendous violence. And there are questions about proportionality, there are questions about outcome that I think have to be taken seriously, especially as my country emerges from a period where violence was used in several circumstances. With respect to what this might mean for OSCE, I think it provides both an acute challenge and a unique opportunity. OSCE has evolved in ways that were probably not contemplated at its inception. NATO has done the same. When Lord Ismay announced that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down, I don't think he would have ever envisaged that several decades later, NATO would have become part and parcel of the creation and recreation of states far afield from its original area of operations. So we're confronted with challenges all the time that are exceptional. How we respond to them defines our own security and defines our collective humanity. And I think there was a dramatic response to a dramatic provocation, and we are just now working through all of those outcomes. Hopefully the reconsideration and restoration of certain basic legal norms, and a fuller consideration of how we might respond to challenges such as terrorism, which has been around since the beginning of civilization. It's not a new phenomenon. It's a spectacular one at the moment.
Thank you. I mean, I'm inclined to, before we get into the details of the OSCE's refreshment and reform program, actually to ask you to help us out here. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. From your own perspectives, thinking about your children, or maybe even your grandchildren, who will probably be alive in the year 2100, what are the things that worry you most? What are the security issues that you think are the most serious? And in order to do that, I thought I'd pick a few. This is my choice. There's probably many more. So I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll come back to you. You have a little think, and you can put your hand up and say, this is the one I think is the most serious and worrying. And please do put your hands up, because none of us knows what's going to happen. And there are no right or wrong answers. So I'm going to give you these choices. Number one, are you most concerned about armed conflict or war? 2, economic collapse leading to social collapse. Because after all, there's huge pressure on global resources from energy demands and climate change. These can trigger economic collapse greater than we've seen already. It's the scenario where they say, buy tinned food and buy a gun. Terrorism, cyber attacks, interesting subject. People can now shut down towns, shut off electricity. Is it the other side of the coin? You're afraid of totalitarian states returning, state surveillance for the computers, taking away our democratic freedoms, a big brother society, to quote from George Orwell? Or would you say, number 6, it's the illegal trafficking, organized crime, international crime, drugs, weapons, people? This is a big threat to our security. So I'll come back to you and ask you those questions in a minute. But first of all, let's turn to the OSCE's plans. So Ambassador Grau, you've already been working on this for some time. There is the feeling in the OSCE, as I understand it, that now is the time to reappraise its priorities, see whether it can become more effective. So can you just outline for us roughly what you think the Swiss presidency, starting in January, is going to be able to achieve?
So what we will be able to achieve, that is still an open question, and that depends not just of us and our plans and our planning, but we have a set of priorities that we already announced a couple of months ago in Vienna. As always, as a chairman, you have to try to keep a certain balance, and that has a lot to do with what we just heard from Adam Kobieratsky, that member states have different views on how the OSCE should function. So what we try to do is have a kind of a triple track set of priorities. A first part that would try to foster security and stability in Europe. A second track of priorities that should help to improve people's lives. And then a third track that should really focus on strengthening the OSCE as such. And I can go in greater details if you want, maybe on the security and stability. That is very much also focused geographically, first and foremost on the Western Balkans. That's going to be an important region for us for obvious reasons, given this tandem with Serbia. There we would like to do more on regional cooperation. I think that's going to be a key issue in the OSCE, but of course beyond, and also try to give some impetus to what we call reconciliation efforts in the Western Balkans. Then the other one would be Southern Caucasus. You still have the protracted conflicts there, two of them. Confidence building, I think, is the key word in the Southern Caucasus. We will also try to look at conventional arms control, which has been in a relatively bad shape for quite some time now. I'm under no illusion. I don't think that we can restart negotiations, but maybe we can use the OSCE as a platform for ideas, exchanges, debates that in an ideal world later on could prepare the ground for some serious negotiations. And then, as Andrew is here, I would also like to mention security sector reform as one of our priority issues in the security and stability track. The improving people's lives track, that is the obvious element there is, of course, human dimension. I mentioned the commitments and the standards that we have established there. I don't think that we can further develop it. I think we should rather focus on implementation of that commitment.
So implementation, I mean, when you were outlining this at the International Peace Institute in New York in June, you did talk about trying to reinforce mediation efforts in places like Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and confidence building measures. Can I just ask you what that means? I mean, I'm not a professional in these terms. When we're talking at terribly entrenched situations like Nagorno-Karabakh or Transnistria, I mean, what does confidence-building measures actually mean?
It's relatively, I mean, sounds simple, but in practice it's extremely challenging. Confidence-building measures aim to create an environment that should be more conducive to find solutions on the conflicts, on the real issues. And it can start with very modest steps on a technical level, look for areas where there are still common interests, where countries can work together. It might sound a bit funny, but there was one moment when we managed to have Azerbaijan and Armenia working together in some expert forums where it was about firefighting, you see. So another project in Georgia, South Ossetia, was about water distribution going from South Ossetia to Georgia. So these really small and also very practical steps. Another track, of course, would be to work more with civil society, bring actors of civil society together on any issues. That is something we would like to dig a bit deeper. It has been tried in the past. It becomes not easier, it becomes rather more difficult over time. What we also see in Armenia, Azerbaijan, the young generation, they do not have a history anymore of living together. I mean, in the Soviet Union, it was one country with, of course, difficulties already at that time, but people used to be together, to have some exchange, and nowadays this becomes more and more difficult, and there's more and more isolation, hate speech, hate crimes even, and our idea would really try to as much as we can, to bring people together on very practical levels.
It's a fantastically broad spectrum, isn't it? But your big organization, you're saying it's working right on the ground on local issues that are likely to have most effect. Can I ask you, Adam Kobieratsky, that Heidi Gao mentioned the Astana Declaration 3 years ago. After a series of conferences, it was the sort of roadmap for the OSCE. But it wasn't entirely approved of by some of the delegations. The EU delegation said it was regrettable that there was no action plan, and the Canadians said that they thought it was disappointing that there was nothing specific in it. Is this unfair criticism, really, of this very long document?
It's a kind of a criticism that you can actually apply to almost all OSCE documents except for the Helsinki Final Act. Let's be clear, the time when an Astana Declaration was negotiated just before the summit, there were high hopes, and there were quite big chances. The way it finally happened is that Astana Declaration serves now as a point of departure for Helsinki Plus 40 process. And yes, it did not, it proved not possible to agree on a program of action. Nevertheless, the document as a framework for what we're doing now is important. You may criticize it, the other parts, or you may criticize the Astana Declaration for what is missing there. Nevertheless, for the OSCE, for our future, it is a very important document. And once more, this kind of criticism, listen, read our documents. We are excellent in producing declarations.
Very good at documents, but I mean, let's be clear. I guess from your point of view, you would like to see more precise, on-the-ground action emerging from these grand statements. Is that fair to say that?
Yes, but in a sense, when children of Astana is the decision of the Vilnius ministerial session from almost 2 years ago about the OSCE role in so-called conflict cycle. And that's important for us. That's important for conflict prevention, because this is our mandate to deal with, to work throughout the entire conflict cycle, not just conflict prevention, but early warning, early action, conflict management, conflict resolution, post-conflict rehabilitation, whatever you wish. And the beginnings of that you can actually find at Astana Declaration. Okay,
just before I turn to you, Andrew, I'm just going to come back to the audience. Let's see what they're worried about. So I'm going to give you a hands-up job. There's 6 choices, remember. Hope you can remember them. War, armed conflict is the first. Economic collapse, terrorism, cyber attack, over-keen state surveillance, Big Brother territory, and illegal trafficking, international crime. So we go for number 1. Who thinks that their children are most at danger from armed conflict? Nobody's putting their hands up, which means you can stop. Everything's okay. All right. What do we think about the danger of some kind of real serious economic collapse leading to social collapse? Because we've seen things getting pretty close in places like Greece. There's a lot of people who think that. Next one is, do we think the biggest threat to the security of our families is terrorism? People feel secure from terrorism. And maybe this region, I mean, obviously in London the Tube has been bombed and we've had the IRA bombing everybody in sight for a while, so we understand what terrorism is like. But, so that's interesting, Andrew. People don't really feel personally threatened by terrorism. Here's a nice one, cyber attack. Yeah, there's a hand there. I've got a feeling people don't really understand the danger of these possibilities. We'll come back to this subject in a minute. There's quite a few people who think this could be the most serious threat to us in the coming years. Quite interesting. Do we feel that there's a danger of, again, it's linked to computers. Are we seeing a phase where the state becomes too powerful, they know everything about you, and they use it to produce a big brother society where your freedoms are eroded? A number of people think that's true. Quite a lot of people putting their hands up for that one. Very interesting that it's a dilemma for the security community. How much do we use this new technology to gather information? And who's going to say don't? Who's going to stop them?
This is just Snowden effect.
The Snowden effect, yes, very well put. I'm going to just ask one more question. There's a lot of effort being put into international crime, trafficking, do we feel that this is going to be something that will spoil the happiness of our children, including drugs, incidentally? No, they don't see that's the main threat, though of course it is a threat. Well, that's extremely interesting. Just before we come back on that, on this cybercrime issue, is Predrag here? I've talked to him earlier. He's an expert on this subject. Predrag, is it possible now for bad people to shut down a city like Belgrade, shut down its electricity, all the computers go off, all the power goes off, all the transport stops? Is it possible for anybody to do that now by flicking a switch?
Yeah, it is possible. Indeed. Especially on the movies. They do it in 1 second.
Seriously, have we got to that point now that it is possible to interfere with the core systems of any big urban situation?
Of course, when it comes to critical infrastructure, here, where nowadays we all imply everything to be by internet, we control it by our smartphones, we control it by computers, we control it by everything, that we are outside, we're not in the office. So, but this means that we actually can shut down anything what we want and what we need. When it comes here to the intruders, actually this gives an access to them to bypass all those securities that we have implied, so they can be able to shut down one city just in 1 second.
Well, that's really reassuring. Thank you.
It is, yeah.
I mean, we know that there are people actively trying to introduce viruses into our systems, actively trying to hack into our systems, and there's lots of people trying to stop them. And this is a race, isn't it? But it's a very interesting subject, and is this territory for the OSCE? Do you think that you should gain some expertise in computer science so that this becomes part of the agenda? Or do you say, no, we've got too much on our plate already, stopping the drug runners, so we won't worry about that one? I'm going to ask you that question first.
Yeah, well, everything that is, not everything, but cyber security, cyber crime to a certain degree is already on the plate in the OSCE, but in a much more modest way probably than you might expect, because what we are trying to do in the OSCE is to have a set of confidence building measures between states. So if something happens, they know this is not state X, Y, Z trying to attack another country. It's on a very basic level, but I think it's important that we can have a fixed set of confidence building measures. Again, it's a lot about confidence building still in OSCE on that specific issue. If I may, on what we just did, I find that quite interesting as an exercise, that we try to just ask the public, what are your views, what are your concerns? In a way, that's what we would like to do a bit more next year, and also in 2015 with Serbia. We would like to involve civil society in a more regular manner in OSCE's activities, and we would also like to have what we call a model use OSCE, so working with young people, getting them together and let them tell us what their concerns are. And ideally, if everything goes according to plan, then we would have at the end of 2014 or maybe somewhere in 2015 a youth action plan that should bring exactly the concerns of the people to the table. And that leads me back to what Adam Kobieratsky said at the beginning. I think the big challenge of OSCE is that we still have a kind of an undercurring differences on the definition or the notion of security. You still have this more traditional concept of security that is focused on the security of a state. And that's exactly the contrary of what we did right now. And then you have the probably more modern notion of security, which is human security, where individuals are at the center of attention, and we check what endangers them and their security. And I think that has been probably an ongoing fight between these two concepts of security since 75.
Extremely interesting. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute. Andrew Michaels, do you think that these Snowden revelations surprise you? And do you think that there is an issue now about security of the individual versus the state? I mean, a lot of people in this room think the state might be the problem.
Well, the state is both the problem and a solution. I would rather see these as complementary concerns rather than ones acting in opposition to one another. Clearly, evolving norms of decency and of domestic and international law require the state to take seriously not just the protection of its borders from enemies without, but also to look after its citizens in the broadest expression of what that means. As the Swiss government has made clear in their program of work, it's about maintaining the dignity of the person. And the state shouldn't be seen as depriving that dignity. Rather, I would argue that it has a duty to reinforce it in various ways, to protect human rights, to assure the physical security of its citizens, and to act responsibly toward its neighbors. Human security is a term that admits of many definitions. I would rather see it as the fullest definition, that we share as humans certain common aspirations, and that we now make claims under law that those aspirations be fulfilled in various ways. At the margins, we can debate about what constitutes human security. Does it include a right to an education, a right to health care? But I think what is incontrovertible is that it insists upon the treatment of the individual as someone possessed of basic human dignity and of rights, especially rights against violation of the human as a corporeal entity. So I was actually reassured, sitting in this room of people who have greater expertise than I, that in their hierarchy of concerns, it actually was the economy that featured more prominently. Because the economy, of course, is what helps to provide dignity, however it's organized, to command a capitalist. People need livelihoods. They need livelihoods to detain them, to keep them busy from thinking about other things, maybe forms of mischief, but also to reinforce their aspirations and to maintain thereby some measure of peace and equilibrium in a society. So I was reassured by that. And I think it answers what your earlier question to me was about the preoccupation with this notion of terrorism. The predominance of that has changed our discourse for a very long time. I think the Swiss program of work makes clear that they wish to reorient the discourse in ways that I find useful, both in principle about the dignity and conscience of human beings, but also specific work such as security sector governance, how to array state institutions so that they meet their obligations to their citizens, as well as the protection of the realm overall.
And what's the mechanism to try to make sure that individual freedoms are protected? The United States has always waved the flag and said we're the land of the free, and yet they're the ones doing most information gathering with Google, Facebook, Twitter, and everything else. This masses and masses of information pouring into huge computer centers in the United States to be processed. I mean, who is going to stop the security industry? The security industry is like an industry out of control. Anybody says, security, security, we have to do this. It's a brave politician who says, no, I'm not going to do it. And who is going to restrain this new phenomenon of surveillance on everybody in the interests of protecting them?
Yeah, that's beyond my level of comprehension. It's a tremendous problem, and once the genie has emerged from the electronic bottle, I haven't figured out a means, technological or otherwise, to put it back in. But there are always ways to circumscribe government conduct. Governments have been intrusive for a very long time. Some have had writs of assistance that have allowed them to enter houses without a judicial warrant, for example. That was a fairly intrusive physical intrusion. Now we have electronic sniffing of information that floats around the internet. I think they're in the process of evolving in various fora, including international fora, data protection regimes, which to greater or lesser effect should manage this in large form. But in small form, of course, we subject ourselves to some of this so-called surveillance by voluntarily placing into the public domain things which we would never have done in the days that we wrote letters to one another and made phone calls. I read Facebook postings of my friends, and I'm aghast some of the things they decide to put into the public domain. There seems to be no shame amongst certain of my friends. But with respect to the government, and it does seem different in character when the government, for its own purposes, collects and holds information. I think in my own country we've seen responses. Some have been extra legal or unlawful responses, and some have been just a general sense that the government has moved beyond the line of the legitimate gathering of information. It's one thing to gather information to attack a criminal problem or to enforce lawful taxation and other things, and quite another just to hold data because we can. And I think in the end, it will be aggrieved or concerned citizens and groups like the ones who convene this very session to put pressure on governments to come up with the solutions to this, which in my view need to be elaborated quickly so that citizens don't lose faith in the government.
It's extremely interesting. You're being very frank to say that it appears they've gone beyond what is legitimate. You talk to students about security and rule of law, and presumably it's all about some kind of democratic accountability in an industry that likes to be secretive. So perhaps you think there should be more transparency on the methods as opposed to the information they get.
My personal views, there needs to be accountability, public accountability to the frontier where secrecy must predominate in order to protect the state. That much of this information is accumulated simply because it's bureaucratically and financially feasible to do so, and then it's held because it's also cheap to store information. The possibility doesn't mean we should do it. There must be legal and prudential limitations on the collection and distribution of private data, and not just by government, but frankly, Google, I'm sure, holds more information about me than my own government, especially certain fiscal information, because I shop like a madman. So we need to be concerned about these things.
Okay, let's ask Ambassador Kobyratsky this question. I mean, you've been involved in this business for quite a long time. Do you sometimes feel that we're not keeping up with what's happening? That arms control is one thing, trying to defuse tension areas is extremely important. But is there something about the modern world that you think the OSCE has got to embrace in a slightly different way, or is it business as usual?
The problem, it's not so much with the OSCE, but the problem with those who complain about OSCE and who say that OSCE is in a crisis and so on and so on. The problem is that, you know, whenever during any process of change, the last thing that actually changes is human mind. Most of this criticism about OSCE is based on memories from the past. And here we have to manage expectations. OSCE will never play the same role as it did in the mid-90s. Simple as it is. Because the world is different. Security environment is different. There's absolutely different need for arms control than it was the case immediately after the Cold War. So OSCE will never be the same. We need to adapt it to the new requirements. And that's the essence of this Helsinki plus 40 process. That's exactly what Heidi was saying. Looking at different things, not just the last thing we need today is another, will be more legally binding security treaties. Sorry. And that was the speciality of the OSCE 20 years ago, and that was perfect at that time, but not today.
So what do you want? Are you seeing it devolve down to a local level more than it is at the moment?
There are three things in the OSCE that should be still kind of kept. First, it's three dimensions, because this is still a perfect combination. Paul Mills, economic, environmental, human rights. Second, the role of the OSCE as a kind of a security dialogue forum which is capable of producing or agreeing on norms, principles, setting standards of behavior and so on. By the way, it's along those lines, plus confidence building, where we could find an OSCE contribution to cybersecurity, for example. We're not capable of doing more. However, in terms of norms, standards, rules, possible confidence building, that's our specialty.
But you could bring together the best expertise. I mean, Lithuania has already responded to its cyber attack by setting up its own specialist unit of expertise. Presumably, the OSCE can draw on member states' expertise and make sure you have the best practice available.
Yes, of course. Let me finish, because I quoted just two, and I said three important things. And the third thing that, from my perspective, should be maintained, so it's the role of OSCE as a security kind of dialogue forum, three dimensions of security, and then our field presences, our work in the field. And I'm not defending the current form of OSCE presences in the field. The important thing is for the OSCE to be still capable to be able to work in the field, wherever we would be welcome. As is to your point, of course, I mean, this is exactly how it works in the OSCE. Whenever the state has an expertise, it's usually happens like that this expertise is actually shared with the organization.
Good. Let's throw it open to the floor. We have a lot of people who know a lot about this subject, global security, the changing environment. So feel free to ask the panel some questions or just make an observation. Please will you keep it concise and stand up and tell us who you are. So we have a cluster of hands coming up over here. So we'll take these three gentlemen, 1, 2, 3, please, and then we'll see what they have to say.
Thank you. My name is Andrej Matišak. I'm a journalist from Slovakia, from Daily Pravda, and it will be more of a remark than a question. I want to step in defense of good-fashioned armed conflict, in fact, because people didn't raise their hands. They probably didn't perceive it as the biggest threat. But, you know, from my perspective, in fact, all things you said after armed conflict, like economic collapse, terrorism, cyber, all those things can lead to armed conflict, real armed conflict. So at the end, I think we shouldn't forget the possibility of an armed conflict might be real when something like economic collapse or big cyber attack or something like or big terrorism attack will happen. After 9/11, we had Afghanistan and Iraq. So I think we should be quite cautious just to forget about good old-fashioned armed conflict. That's my remark. And I would like to put maybe in the mix, you mentioned also the climate change, the impact of the climate change, which some people perceive it as another real risk. Some people even say it's not happening. For many people, it might be a real challenge in a near future. Many people would say that it is happening, and it is happening right now. So maybe if I may ask, if my question at the end may be, would you put the climate change into the mix of security risk of the future? Thank you.
Very good question. Yes, please.
Hello, Jonathan Marley, the London School of Economics. And a question for the ambassador. You made 2 points. One about the volume of analysis and early warning reports that you receive. And on the other hand, you made the point that you feel that states are now less inclined to allow OSCE intervention. By implication, there is a suggestion there that there are issues that you cannot reach within states. Just a question on that then is, do you have any particular issues in mind in that regard, and are there any alternatives to the OSCE in trying to address those issues? Thank you.
And one more? Do we have one more? Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Eric Bakte from Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Two remarks. One concerns arms control, and I'd just like to very much echo what Adam has said about the need for the greater need more than ever on highlighting the issue of arms control, because we should not forget that there are increasingly occasions and increasing challenges coming from the use of, especially of weapons of mass destruction by non-state actors, who are, of course, even more difficult to identify, to locate than state actors. So I mean, this is certainly one reason why this subjects should definitely not be neglected. Regarding cyber security, I feel ever more convinced, having listened to the discussion, that I did the right thing when I raised my hands in favor of cyber being the most eminent challenge, because all the other challenges that we have met, economic collapse, terrorism, and others, can be closely interlinked with cyber. Because if there's a cyber attack against, let's say, the computerized network of critical infrastructure, if anything is a terrorist attack, that certainly is. Or, for instance, if let's say the air traffic control system is attacked by a cyber attack, of course, this could lead to a plane crashing and into, let's say, a populated area and causing thousands and thousands of deaths. I mean, if anything is a terrorist attack, that certainly is. So certainly we are right when we're putting increasing emphasis on the issue of cyber attack. And we're also right in seeing a role in this regard among the different international organizations, from Council of Europe to NATO. Of course, the question is whether this is a key issue for that organization to deal with, or just a side issue, so to say. But certainly, and examples have shown in recent years and decades that these organizations do the right thing when they are paying increasing attention to those issues, and I think they will have to do it in the future as well. And in addition to that, this also gives another reason why it is so important also for these different international organizations to increasingly interact with each other. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Three very interesting interventions. I mean, obviously, your idea of somehow having a public consultation, it sounds like it's a good idea. I mean, the EU does this every now and then, and they set up an online site and people can send in their comments. So I think that would be a really good move, especially focused on the concerns of young people. But what we've got here, apart from, don't forget the importance of arms control, is that there are new challenges, aren't there? Let's just take the climate change one first, and we won't spend too much time on it. But I've been, as a journalist, I've been interested in climate change for some time, and I've been to some conferences where the experts from the International Panel on Climate Change have been presenting their evidence. And personally, I'm completely convinced that it's happening, and it's happening almost entirely, substantially at least, because of human activity, and that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere continue to climb, and there's probably going to be a tipping point, and things will suddenly start to get worse, and all the cities that are on the coastal strips are going to be in trouble, and there'll be more serious weather events, and there will be more desertification and less food, and there'll be water wars and mass migration. So, I mean, I personally think climate change is a serious issue. It's a long-term issue, that's the problem. Nobody knows how long, even if it does happen, how long this will take. But it may be only 2 generations away that you've got a very, very turbulent world caused by these things. So, again, is it something that the OSCE should put in its portfolio?
I think it is already in the portfolio of the OSCE in a probably not very obvious way at the first glance, but we know that climate change leads to probably more storms, more powerful storms, more flooding, droughts, and so on, and so on, and so on. So disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness will be an issue also for the OSCE. But at the same time, what is important there, the OSCE is not the only organization. The OSCE is not alone. And I think that climate change and the results or impacts of climate change on security, that is very much a topic where other organizations are probably even more important, or where it is important to have a cooperation between OSCE and other organizations, and that's exactly what we would like to try next year, and where we would like to dig a bit deeper. The OSCE is a regional organization of the UN, and the UN is very much leading disaster preparedness activities. So we would like to use the OSCE almost as a sounding board next year for what the UN does on a global level. It might have an impact also on discussions about the Millennium Development Goals, the post-2015 process. So link the OSCE up with other organizations, make sure that you have a reasonable division of labor with the UN, with other organizations in Europe, with UNODC, so that's not so much climate change, but again, back to drugs and crime. So there are many organizations that have something to bring to the table. OSCE is one of them, and for this global challenge, it's really, I think it's key that the organization hooks up with other ones.
We're going to come back to the subject in a second, because it's a crucial question, the distinctive role of OSCE in an international environment where there are a lot of organizations, and some say there's duplication. But before we do that, let's just pick up on what the third questioner was asking specifically, Ambassador, about the frustrations, perceived frustrations of the OSCE being, if you like, not exactly welcome in suggesting internal affairs issues. And is there another way, I think was the question, was it? If the OSCE isn't exactly welcomed, is there another way of exerting pressure?
Can I still have 2 points on climate change?
You certainly can.
Thank
yes,
you.
Yes, of
Two
course
quick points on climate change. In addition to what Heidi said, we also have a special institution which can be of help in that regard as far as climate is concerned, climate change. OSCE Coordinator for Economic and Environmental Affairs. And Goran, as far as I can see, is here, a former OSCE. And this institution, this coordinator, can actually do a lot, because there is all obvious environmental impact. And second, we are affected deeply by climate change. This year in Vienna, we had 40 plus in summer. Okay?
Well, Belgrade, the last couple of years.
Now we're talking Vienna. Now about the question. Listen, the thing is, I receive, as every other OSCE bureaucrat, I receive 2 briefs daily from Citrum, early morning brief and afternoon brief, plus once a week a brief, a kind of an early warning brief about developments in the entire OSCE area. So this is being shared with those who work in the OSCE. The problem is that we, by this decision on conflict cycles, we are committed to do more on early warning. The problem is, if I would get a kind of an early warning or some early warning signals, then I have to think not twice, but I have to think 10 times whether I can share this early warning with all the delegations. What would have happened if I would have shared the early warning signal openly, distributing it as a report to all the delegations, if that would be on one of the European Union member states?
Can you give us an example of the kind of thing you're talking about? You can make one up as long as it's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Listen, all the constitutional problems in some changes of constitution in some of the EU states. Listen, I'm still, even though I'm talking personally here, I'm still being paid by the OSCE, so by all participating states.
Okay.
The thing is, once more, participating states still are not, they are still not in a position to accept that our bureaucracy can actually issue an early warning signal concerning them. They all agreed on early warning as a concept, but then applicability of early warning to each and every participating state is a different story. What we're doing about it, we have a special working group dealing with conflict cycle, and we're talking extensively to the chairmanship. And I'm sure with Heidi next year, we will spend hours talking about this issue. You know, there are, by the way, there are of course kind of smart ways of issuing that early warning. Whatever cannot be done formally, we can always try to do informally. Feed the information into whatever other statement, other intervention. But
okay, and
one thing
yes,
about arms control, because there was a point by a Hungarian colleague about no, not Hungary, sorry, about armed conflict and the fact that it's still a potential threat or risk. Yes, provided the recognition of armed conflict as a threat to security would not lead us to what I'm calling militarization of security policy. If you think about potential armed conflict, you need first of all to think about how to prevent armed conflict. And here you have a lot of instruments which are not purely military in nature. So yes, armed conflict may be a threat, provided the conclusion from that would not be, okay, we need more military instruments to deal with that threat. That's it.
Before we move on to the second part of this panel is to really try to focus, give some suggestions to the OSCE in its reform program. Just looking at the nature of the world we live in and the threats we're in, extremely interesting, incidentally, so far, that if you have a tense situation, and we have a whole number of them, particularly in the Caucasus, where there's mistrust and conflicts between tribes. I mean, this is not an official word, it's my word, but it's tribalism. We want to go back to what the former British Prime Minister said were his 3 top priorities. He said, my 3 top priorities are education, education, and education. This was before he started telling lies about Iraq, incidentally. And certainly there is academics will say that if you have a very robust education system, everybody has access to good education. It is the way to exchange prejudice and mistrust with understanding and tolerance. Is this at the front end of the process, as opposed to the back end of the process, which might involve military intervention ultimately? Is the front end of the process education, do you think, or is that really not your territory?
Education, yes. I mean, if you look at some of the OSCE missions or presences on the ground, it has very often a link to education, to working with schools, with universities, with textbooks, trying to get some key basic messages across, linked to ethnic minorities, linked to other issues. So I think there are already now activities ongoing that work with students, with young people, education in general. I think it's one of the possibilities how to approach.
It's not top of your priority list, but it is certainly in there on the ground activity to try to give access to education and bring young people into the process. Okay, I just thought
I'd maybe just a word on education. Then we are again back to how much, and that's what Adam framed very nicely, how much are states, countries, governments open to let the OSCE work, and to what degree are they open to cooperate with OSCE, because the organization can bring so many things to a country, but we need a basic level of readiness to have that cooperation, and to also open up for sometimes really critical sectors as education is. And usually especially in the regions where we have difficulties, where we have protracted conflicts and so on, where countries are not necessarily the most open ones to let this happen.
It's British priority, three priorities: education, education, education. In the case of the OSCE, with regard to so-called protracted conflicts, I would say that our priority is reconciliation, reconciliation, reconciliation. This is what we can do. We have instruments for that. I mean, we cannot negotiate a solution of the conflict. We do contribute, we participate in negotiations. 5+2, we are in Geneva discussions. So we cannot impose a solution. But once there will be a solution emerging, I'm sorry, there will be a need for buy-in process. Yeah. And combined with reconciliation, OSCE is best place to do that.
Okay, we have a hand up. Anybody else want to contribute? There's two. Anybody else? Anybody else? Let's take microphones to these two people here. You've got one already, and then it'll be followed by the lady on your left. Thank you. Can you tell us who you are, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Selmo Cikotic. I represent Faculty of Political Science from Sarajevo. The panel so far has already shown how complex the spectrum of all security threats and challenges is, and also indicated that their number is constantly growing, the new ones are rising, and they are mutually interlocked, interdependent very often, and very hard to predict. I'd like to see what thoughts have been given so far within OSCE in terms of national and international level, in terms of mental or mindset preparedness for changing the predominantly reactive mode of security system into a proactive one, into a preventive one. Some of the ideas have already been shared with the audience, and I would like also to see in that light how the role of traditional or conventional security structures has been perceived within that environment, and how it is being reflected on international level, provided that security is more and more interdependent and the states individually cannot provide security for their citizens. So the comprehensive model of security being pursued within OSCE is also leaned upon the collective security system of NATO, global security system of UN, and cooperative security model of EU. How that function on the level of international community, and how do you interrelate those mechanisms with individual modern state security systems? Thank you.
Well, that's a big question. Thank you very much. But it will touch on what we're going to be talking about. Oh, it's you next. Fine. Just tell us who you are.
My name is Vladimir Božović. I'm State Secretary of Minister of Interior of Republic Serbia. Welcome to Serbia, and be safe and security in Belgrade. I think so when you are thinking and talking about all aspects, maybe we miss corruption. Corruption is very important things, and new government of Serbia fighting against corruption. We are adopting a new national strategy about fighting against corruption and action plan about it. And maybe my question is for experts and ambassadors from OSCE mission: how can we provide new strategy fighting against corruption on the national and international level cooperation? And one thinks about cybercrime. I think so that all aspects, organized crime, terrorism, many another drugs, illegal immigration, is linked with cybercrime. In my point of view, cybercrime is the new maybe model of the crime or classic crime who using new technology. And also it's very important to think how can we find the border between respect of human rights in one hand and using new technology to control cyber terrorism, cyber attacks, and cyber crime generally.
Indeed.
Thank you so much.
That was exactly the point we were making before. It is a dilemma, isn't it? Thank you for the contribution. And I mean, corruption, I'm sorry I didn't put it on my list, but I didn't want my list to be too long. And we've heard in the previous session that the EU standards which Serbia will now have to meet, this is obviously going to be a very big challenge, because we know that in this part of the world it's an issue in many countries. So I wish you luck with that, but I would have thought that it is very much a national competence issue, because, I mean, if you have too many people giving jobs to their friends and no transparency in society and mistrust, it's terribly damaging to democracy and trust for the political process. So I wish you the best of luck, and I think it's something that really has to be done at this level. That's my view. But we'll ask our experts to respond to the comments, and maybe we can take the cue about the OSCE's role dealing with nation states, but also linking with other international organizations. And this is the key point. I'm going to ask Andrew first. You've looked at international security issues all over the place, dealt with different agencies. As the OSCE reassesses itself, what do you think its position is, which is distinctive from the position of other big organizations? The EU, in the last 40 years, as we've heard, has got much bigger and much more involved in these kind of issues. Do you think the OSCE is basically no longer required, or it should be a much slimmer, different organization? I mean, what is its position in the international community?
An excellent question. I was thinking about this earlier today. I don't come from a slim organization, so I don't even know what that looks like. But I think it's fair that any international organization be responsive to its constituent members. And the OSCE, to me, has one distinct comparative advantage, and that is probably a capability which was unforeseen 40 years ago, but which has proven indispensable in these past years, and that is the ability, flexibility, and relatively quickly to deploy specialist personnel to areas experiencing one part or another of the conflict cycle that Adam referenced previously. Like any ad hoc arrangement, it's not going to be perfect, it may not be fast enough, it may not be staffed exactly properly, but it is a capability, it is special because it's responsive to the needs of its members, and in some ways thereby more suited to many regional circumstances or problems than the United Nations, or for that matter, any other regional organization which I've studied. Once the missions, of course, take root, they begin to look different. They tend to take on lives of their own. I have friends who run these missions, and they are people of the utmost good faith, but they have themselves to contend with objectives set in Vienna that sometimes aren't exactly coherent or aligned to local circumstances. The other benefit of these missions is that they have created across the area of operations cadres of young national officers who are inculcated with the values of OSCE and trained in diplomatic techniques. We often neglect this, but there are literally hundreds now, maybe thousands, of people throughout the entire area from Central Asia through to the Western Balkans who have worked for OSCE for a number of years, and that changes the organization, it changes the OSCE, but it also changes the individuals as they go back into their countries and do various good works. And so I would call that out as the first and maybe paramount benefit of an organization like OSCE at the moment.
It's on the ground expertise, sharing a common vision. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Diplomacy can't be phoned in, it can't be done electronically. At the end of the day, it's human beings looking at problems, interacting with interlocutors, and finding ways through difficult situations. You don't do that by air forces, you don't do it by ground forces, you do it ultimately. Nobody would, I think, find this controvertible as a proposition. You're ultimately doing it by reaching agreements, and OSCE has a proud tradition of engaging over time, and in so doing has probably prevented serious conflict from breaking out elsewhere, has mitigated some, and has helped put some broken places back together a bit.
So, Ambassador Kobiratsky, we're drawing to a close this session. What do you see as being the unique selling point of the OSCE? And in this Helsinki Plus 40 process, what do you personally want to see as the result?
I'm sorry, Richard, I'm a bit unruly. I will still have a comment on a different issue.
You can say whatever you want to say. Do that first.
Your point about OSCE position. I'm sorry, but no beauty contest, please. In this multipolar world, there is a place for every international organization and institution. We cannot compare ourselves. We cannot compare OSCE to the EU or NATO. Still, now, as NATO is withdrawing from Afghanistan, I have colleagues from NATO. I used to serve at NATO headquarters a few years ago. Colleagues from NATO coming to me and asking, Adam, can you help us a bit? You know, you have those field presences in Central Asia. We are kind of interested. Now, EU, we cannot compare to the EU. Whenever it comes to elections in Kosovo, it's us who are facilitating the elections, not EU. So there is a praise, there's a piece of cake for everybody. Now, what are the strengths of the OSCE? Comprehensive approach to security, as we say. Comprehensiveness, inclusiveness, consensus. Consensus is both a problem and something positive. It is a problem when it comes to negotiate whatever decision, because it takes ages to agree on a comma if you have to convince 57. The beauty of consensus is once something is agreed, it's not imposed. So it's a bit easier, relatively speaking, to be implemented. The future of the OSCE, listen, we have to kind of readapt ourselves, not just to new threats to security, but also to the fact that, listen, most challenges to security nowadays come not from the states, but from the territories of states, from the weak states, from organized crime, from terrorist groups, and we are intergovernmental organization. So we have to look at instruments that we have at our disposal. But that was the idea behind Helsinki Plus 40, not to reinvent the wheel, but to adapt our vehicle to the roads that we will have to travel. I strongly, given the way it's going on, of course, it's classic OSCE. So far, we managed to agree that we need to talk about it. And we managed to agree on some concept, but not on practical steps. Still, the process is in very able hands, and actually we in the OSCE, we are extremely happy about this combined consecutive Swiss-Serbian chairmanships, because this gives us 2 years perspective, which for projects like Helsinki Plus 40 is important. So I think there are all arguments, there are all signs that Helsinki Plus 40 will produce something. Not yet another treaty, not yet another empty declaration, but hopefully a series of agreements, arrangements, understandings that could be later kind of summarized or summed up for in 2015. So I think that there are all signs that Helsinki Plus 40 will not, stress, will not, in line with the worst OSCE tradition, will not turn or become, or will not be transferred into Helsinki Plus 50.
Well, if there's one thing you'd like the OSCE to do which would improve its effectiveness, what would it be? Reconciliation.
Reconciliation understood in the most kind of generic sense. I mean, I'm not talking reconciliation here in this part of Europe only, not here, not just in the Balkans. We're talking about reconciliation, at all levels. Reconciliation as a preventive tool, as conflict prevention. We're talking about reconciliation as conflict resolution, post-conflict rehabilitation. And it is Balkans, it is Central Europe, it is post-Soviet space, it is Central Asia, it is Caucasus, it is everywhere.
Okay, so, Ambassador Grau, this is a very big issue for you. So, in your personal view, what do you hope that this dual presidency will achieve. And how are you going to measure success? How do you know whether you've succeeded or not?
Well, what we would like to achieve with our tandem presidency, I think, is what I would call to reverse the trend. By reversing the trend, I mean countering this tendency of growing mistrust between mainly East and West, and also reversing the trend in maybe a shrinking confidence of states in the capabilities of OSCE. That is directly linked with the budget question. We haven't discussed this today, but the OSCE is definitely, it's a lean and a very slim organization that is getting slimmer and slimmer because the budget is not growing. It's, in fact, it's shrinking. So reverse the trend. How are we going to do that? I mean, that is, of course, it's a very challenging task. What I see is now this Switzerland-Serbia tandem. I think that is, for me, almost the nucleus of something bigger. With something bigger, I mean a more systematic engagement, the East with the West, the EU going beyond the limits of the more like-minded, reaching out to other countries in the OSCE space in a more systematic manner. Dialogue, I think we cannot stress this enough. It's crucial. Ada mentioned the weekly dialogue on security issues going on in Vienna. There is no other platform where all these countries come together at one table. They can raise any issue they want, and this happens in a weekly format. What we would like to see is identify and shape islands of cooperation. I think we heard many good ideas today, what the important issues are, what the big issues are. Probably we have to start with smaller steps on topics that have the potential to bring countries closer together. Transnational threats was mentioned today, a couple of others. Maybe the second dimension still has the potential to bring countries closer together. So the islands of cooperation, the smaller ones, and at the same time we should not forget to keep preparing the ground for the big issues. And I think big issues are still the protracted conflicts that are not solved, the human dimension, the implementation of standards there. So that's a bit the way how we want to approach it.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll wish you luck in having a breakthrough in some of these protracted conflicts. There's been a lady who's been desperately wanting to make a final point, and there is time. If you'd be nice and concise, please tell us who you are and what it is you want to say.
I certainly do hope it's not the final point, because I think this is an endless job.
I think it is going to be the final point,
Just for the part. My name is Gordana Čamić. I'm member of permanent delegation OSCE-PA and the report for Serbia and rapporteur for third committee of OSCE-PA. And I voted for seed of come very serious worries about state surveillance, about states telling me that it is for my own security and safety not to interfere with my own personal data. You know, I grew up in such a society. It was called one-party system, and states know much better. They knew everything better than each citizen individually. Being a woman, I had bunch of people who knew much better what is good for me. So I don't like it.
Okay,
and
you're not
that's
alone.
My point.
A lot of other people put their hands up at the same point. So thank you very much for emphasizing that point. And it is a very interesting one. I have some personal sympathy with it. 2 minutes left. I just wanted to ask Andrew, each of you, looking at the security situation in the OSCE area, how optimistic, pessimistic are we? There was a session yesterday called The World in Crisis, which was very dramatic. I thought, is the world in crisis? I suppose it might be. If you said 1 is very pessimistic and 10 is very optimistic, where would you go on whether security is worsening or improving?
My biology and psychology pushes me toward 8 or 9.
You're really optimistic.
I am optimistic. We in the security business tend to focus on problem areas and are neglectful of everything that happens around us. The positive side of information is that we all know each other a bit better. If that's put to proper use, I think that's useful. There are problem areas where the OSCE can be especially useful. I am concerned about what Afghanistan will look like as that transition occurs, and I think OSCE has a role there. But in terms of the world, I think we can empirically demonstrate that it's becoming a safer place with some notable eruptions.
I'm not going to ask you that question because we're running out of time, and I know that you're both more optimistic than pessimistic, otherwise you wouldn't be doing this job. We've had an interesting discussion where globalized world needs an international body. Andrew Michaels basically said it's crucial to have an OSCE, and Ambassador Kobiratsky obviously says reconciliation is the key thing that the OSCE should be doing, and emphasize work in the field. And it's nice to see that Heidi's Islands of Cooperation is an interesting approach, and that you want to see more effective action in mediation as well. So we'll see how this process develops. A fascinating discussion, and I hope this has provided some food for thought for the OSCE guests here as it re-examines its priorities. So I'd just like to say thank you to our brilliant panelists, Ambassador Gao, Ambassador Kobiratsky, and Andrew Michaels. Apologies again that Deputy Prime Minister Vučić couldn't make it because he has to be tested. And thank you also to the Swiss Foreign Affairs Ministry for helping to set up and co-organize this session with the Belgrade Security Forum. And of course, thank you all for listening so intently and contributing your questions and suggestions to help make the world a safer place. The next plenary session is interesting. It's on gender and the role of the state, and that's at 3 o'clock in here. And after that, there are 4 breakout sessions. So coming up is the networking lunch. Networking is an important part of this forum, and you'll have plenty of time to meet new people and exchange views. So enjoy the lunch, and please join me in thanking our expert panel. Thank you very much.